If you haven't subscribed yet, now's the time. When the channel reaches 1,000 subscribers, I'll share a surprise story I've prepared especially for you. The wind came in short, hard bursts off the Pacific, carrying salt and ash from somewhere beyond the reefs. The island, a small patch of rock and scrub in the Ryukyu chain, looked almost abandoned, except for the handful of U.S. Navy personnel working in silence around a half-collapsed communications post built into the cliffs. Most of the equipment was rusted or scorched. A single generator coughed behind a sheet of corrugated metal, its hum faltering every few minutes like a man on the edge of fainting. Inside the bunker, Lieutenant May Callahan sat at a small wooden table covered with radio parts, her hands steady even though her eyes showed the strain of sleepless nights. She was 26, her uniform faded from the sun, the insignia at her collar half torn. Before the war, she had worked as a signal instructor in San Diego, organized, sharp, and optimistic. But after her brother's ship was sunk off Leyte, something in her went quiet. Her decision to volunteer for forward deployment had been less about duty and more about guilt. She told no one that. The others assumed she wanted promotion. In truth, she just couldn't stay behind while someone else took his place on the line. Her job here was simple on paper. Maintain the radio network, linking the island's forward observation points with the Allied fleet to the south. But that fleet hadn't responded to her calls in 3 days. Either the signal was too weak, or no one was left to listen. She rubbed her eyes, glanced at the trembling red needle on the transmitter dial, and adjusted the frequency again. Static filled the room, breaking in irregular bursts like distant thunder. The walls were damp, the air heavy with mildew and oil. Every so often, a soldier passed the doorway, boots scraping, shoulders hunched, faces that had stopped expecting news. Outside, the rain began to fall again. It was never heavy enough to wash anything clean, just enough to make the mud slick and the air thick. May stood to stretch, her back aching from the low ceiling, and stepped to the entrance where she could see the beach, a narrow strip of gray, sand littered with crates and twisted antenna poles. She could smell the burned fuel from a downed aircraft somewhere inland. That was when Chief Petty Officer Daniel Kessler arrived with what remained of his crew, 4 exhausted men pushing a damaged radio truck. He was in his mid-30s, tall, with a quiet presence that made people step aside without him asking. His face was sun-beaten and lined, his right hand wrapped in bandages. His eyes, a grayish blue, never stayed still for long. They scanned everything like a habit he couldn't stop. He had served in the Philippines, on a convoy that never made it home. Half his unit had drowned after a night raid. He had stopped talking much after that, except when necessary. May watched as the truck was rolled into position near the bunker. The men looked half dead from exhaustion. Kessler gave a brief nod before walking over to her, his boots sinking slightly into the mud. "Lieutenant Callahan?" he asked. His voice was rough, as if scraped by sand. "That's me," she said. "You're the signal detail from the Southern Ridge?" "Was," he answered simply. "Only us now. Lost the others 2 nights ago." May didn't press for details. She learned not to. Instead, she motioned toward the bunker. "Generator's weak. Transmitter's worse. If you can help me keep it alive, we might still reach the fleet." He followed her inside without another word. For a moment, the light from outside cut across the room, highlighting the dust, the rusted metal, the stacked rations in the corner. Then the door shut, and they were back in the low, buzzing dimness of the radio post. Hours passed in near silence, broken only by the tapping of tools and the faint hum of the radio. May could feel her nerves tighten every time the generator sputtered. Each flicker of light made her stomach clench. She told herself it was just a machine, not fear, but she knew better. Fear was constant here. You learned to keep working through it. Kessler was steady. His movements were efficient, precise. He didn't speak unless something needed saying. That calm unsettled her at first, then started to feel like a kind of anchor. When she caught herself glancing at him too often, she forced her focus back to the dials. By late afternoon, they had the primary set working again. The transmission light blinked faintly. May sat forward, headset on, and began sending coded calls to the fleet. The static replied with nothing but its usual low growl. She repeated the signal 3 times. Still nothing. Kessler leaned against the wall, arms crossed, watching the generator's flicker reflect on the wet floor. "They hear you?" he asked quietly. "No," she said. "They should have by now." He nodded, as if that confirmed something he already suspected. Might not be anyone left out there to answer. May stared at the transmitter, her jaw tightening. "There has to be," she said, not to him but to herself. "We're supposed to hold this station until relief arrives. That's the mission." Kessler didn't argue. He simply checked the generator, tightened a bolt, and went back to his corner. Outside, the rain thickened into a steady downpour. Dusk settled over the island like smoke. The faint sound of distant voices, foreign, rhythmic, carried through the wind from somewhere inland. May turned toward the sound, her stomach knotting. Kessler listened too, head tilted. "You hear that?" "Yeah," she said. "They're closer than yesterday." The air in the bunker felt heavier now, the walls closer. May sat back down, removing her headset, trying to quiet her breathing. Her hands trembled slightly, so she pressed them together. She thought about her brother, about the telegram that had arrived 3 months ago, the way her mother's voice broke when she read it aloud. She had promised herself then that she'd do something that mattered before the war ended, something that might make up for surviving when he didn't. She didn't say any of that to Kessler. He seemed to understand anyway. He nodded once, almost imperceptibly, and said, "We'll hold." That was all. As the generator dimmed again, May scribbled a line in the logbook. No response from fleet. Enemy movement confirmed East Ridge. Continue transmissions hourly. She set the pencil down, adjusted her collar, and stared out at the darkening sea. The radio crackled faintly behind her, a heartbeat in the silence. The outpost was alone. The world beyond the island might as well have been gone. But for now, their mission was simple. Keep the signal alive, keep the position holding, and wait for orders that might never come. And in that shared uncertainty, in the sound of rain on tin and static in the dark, the quiet bond between May Callahan and Daniel Kessler began to form, without words, without promises. Just the recognition that both had come here to survive something bigger than themselves, and neither could afford to fail again. The rain had not stopped for 2 straight days. It came in soft, persistent sheets, tapping on a metal roof of the bunker, dripping through the cracks in the sandbag wall. The air was thick with moisture and fatigue. The island felt smaller now, every sound, every breath echoing off the soaked earth. The men slept in shifts, their rifles leaning against the walls like tired sentinels. Lieutenant May Callahan hadn't slept in nearly 30 hours. Her eyes were red, her voice hoarse from calling frequencies that gave her nothing but static. She sat beside the transmitter again, her fingers raw from turning the same dials, over and over. She could tell the others were beginning to lose faith, not in her, but in the possibility of being heard at all. Chief Petty Officer Daniel Kessler entered quietly, a wet poncho clinging to his shoulders. He shook off the rain, placed a small tin of coffee grounds on the table, and sat across from her without a word. He looked the same as the night before, calm, watchful, unshaken, but she could see the exhaustion behind his stillness. "Any response?" he asked. She shook her head. "Not even a carrier ping. Either the signal's too weak, or they've pulled back farther than we thought. Or they're gone," he said evenly. May looked up from the console, a flicker of irritation in her eyes. "We don't know that." He gave a small nod, conceding, and poured a bit of coffee powder into 2 denim mugs. The water from his canteen was lukewarm, tasting faintly of rust. They drank in silence, the sound of rain filling the gaps between them. She finally asked what had been sitting in the back of her mind since his arrival. "What happened to your men on the ridge?" He stared at the table for a long time before answering. "Ambush. Mortars first, then a night assault. We pulled back toward the beach, but they were already cutting us off. Only 4 made it out with me." She hesitated. "And the others?" Kessler's voice stayed low. "Didn't have time to bury them." That silence lingered, heavy but human. It wasn't the kind of quiet that asked for sympathy, just the mutual understanding of people who'd already lost too much. Outside, a distant sound broke through the rain, faint, rhythmic chanting. Both of them froze. They stepped toward the door, brushing past the hanging tarp, and listened. The sound carried through the jungle from somewhere east of the ridge, a deep, coordinated roar that rolled like thunder through the fog. Kessler joined her, scanning the horizon with binoculars. The glass fogged instantly, but he didn't need a clear view. He could already tell what it was. "That's them," he muttered. "They're gathering." "How many?" she asked quietly. He lowered the binoculars. "A lot." The chanting faded again, swallowed by the wind, but it left an echo in their chests, a steady pulse of dread that didn't fade with silence. That night, May logged the event in the operations record, noting increased enemy activity east sector. She forced herself to write in the clipped, official tone she'd been trained for. But inside, she knew what it meant. The final push was coming, and they were in the way. By dawn, the rain turned into a fine mist. The outpost looked ghostly, pale light reflecting off puddles, empty helmets sitting on crates, smoke curling from a dying campfire. May and Kessler worked together on the antenna mast that had been torn by wind. Her hands were numb, but she refused to stop. He climbed the base with a wrench and a coil of wire, movement steady, deliberate. She caught herself studying him for a moment, not out of curiosity, but something closer to recognition. The way he moved, the way he spoke only when needed, reminded her of her brother, patient, methodical, carrying pain without showing it. When he climbed down, she said, "You've done this before." He gave a half smile that didn't reach his eyes. "A few too many times. Keeps me from thinking." May nodded. "Does it work?" He looked out toward the sea, where gray waves crashed against black rock. "Sometimes." The moment hung there, two people standing in the wreckage of purpose, pretending not to be afraid. Later that day, they received the first direct report from Marine Scout who had barely made it back through the ridge. He was trembling, covered in mud, his eyes wide. "They're coming," he said. "Thousands of them. They're not waiting for night this time." May asked, "Command's response?" "Nothing," the Marine said. "No contact. No air support. You're the only one still transmitting." When he left, May stood in silence for a long time, her mind racing. 10,000 men. No fleet. No reinforcements. The logical thing would be to prepare for evacuation, but there were no boats left, only the minefield along the northern cliffs, planted months ago and long forgotten. She went back to the radio, turning the knobs again, pressing the transmitter key with more force than necessary. The static screamed through the speakers, then faded back into emptiness. She leaned her head against her hands, whispering to herself, "There has to be another way." Kessler, watching from the corner, said quietly, "There usually is. Just not one they'll approve." She turned to him. "What do you mean?" He didn't answer. He just met her eyes, calm, steady, waiting for her to think it through. That night, the generator failed twice. The last bulb flickered over their table as they sat surrounded by maps, radio parts, and the sound of distant drums echoing through the jungle. The others were asleep or pretending to be. May stared at the maps spread before her, tracing the lines of the cliffs with her finger. Her mind worked through possibilities, calculations, angles of signal strength. The wreck of the old naval beacon was still out there on the beach, half buried, but functional. She remembered its power range, the way its pulse could override weaker signals. Slowly, a thought began to form, reckless, desperate, but alive. She looked up at Kessler, who was tightening the bolts on his rifle. "If we can't reach the fleet," she said, "maybe we don't need to." He frowned slightly. "What are you thinking?" She exhaled, her voice low. "If we can trick them into moving where we want them to go, we might not need reinforcements." For a moment, the only sound was the rain returning. Heavier now, drumming against the metal roof. Kessler studied her expression, searching for any trace of hesitation. There was none, just quiet resolve and exhaustion. He leaned back, arms crossed. "That's forbidden," he said softly. "I know," she replied. Their eyes met in the dim light. Not defiance, not rebellion, just understanding. Both of them had already broken too many rules just by surviving this long. Outside, the horizon flashed faintly with distant artillery. The wind shifted. Somewhere deep in the jungle, the chanting rose again, louder this time, unified, unstoppable. Inside the bunker, May's pencil moved slowly across the map, sketching the beginnings of a plan that no one had ordered and no one would ever approve. And for the first time since the war began, she felt something close to clarity. Not hope, not courage, but the cold certainty that the next decision she made would either save them all or finish them. The storm eased by morning, but the sky stayed heavy and gray, the kind of light that flattened everything, cliff, sea, faces, into one color. May Callahan stood at the edge of the bunker, staring toward the bay where the wreck of the naval beacon lay half buried in wet sand. The tide had dragged half of it out to sea, but the steel frame still glinted beneath the surface. She remembered inspecting it weeks ago, when it was just another useless relic from a destroyed ship. Now it might be their only chance. Behind her, Kessler stepped out of the bunker, holding a roll of signal wire over his shoulder. He had been quiet since their conversation the night before, but his silence didn't mean disapproval. He was the kind of man who weighed consequences before speaking. "You're really going to use that wreck?" he asked. "If it still powers up," she said. "The circuits are shot, but if we can reroute it through the field transmitter, we can make it broadcast again, long enough to send a strong pulse." Kessler crouched beside a crate, uncoiling the wire. "A pulse to do what?" "To draw them toward the cliffs," she said, nodding toward the northern ridge. "That's where the old mines are buried, the ones the engineers planted last year. They were never cleared. If we can make them think the signal is a retreat point or a supply beacon, they'll charge straight into it." He studied her for a moment, expression unreadable. "That's not an approved tactic." May met his eyes. "Neither is dying waiting for orders that never come." That line hung between them for a long second before he gave a single nod. "Then we'll need to rewire everything. That beacon's power core is half rusted through. We overload it, it blows. Too little power, they'll spot the ruse." "I'll take that risk," she said. He almost smiled. "I figured you would." The rest of the morning passed in near silence, except for the sound of boots in the mud and tools clanking against metal. Kessler worked with deliberate focus, pulling apart cables, stripping insulation with a knife, and connecting makeshift plugs from scavenged parts. May stayed beside the radio table, running calculations on the signal range and frequency overlap. She had never done field engineering, but her brain worked in systems and patterns. She found herself thinking about her brother again, how he used to tinker with ship radios on the deck, laughing when she complained about the static. Now, she thought, that same static was all she had left of him. Kessler glanced at her once, noticing her stillness. "You've done this before?" he asked quietly. She shook her head. "Only in training. Back then it was just code exercises and clean uniforms. Now," she looked at her trembling hands. "Now it's something else." He nodded, fastening the final wire with a small twist. "You're doing fine. Fear keeps your hands from shaking too much. It means you're thinking." That unexpected calmness in his tone settled her nerves. He wasn't trying to reassure her. He was grounding her. By late afternoon, they had the basic circuit connected. The beacon would transmit once more, its signal strong enough to reach over the ridge and deep into the jungle valley. The rest of the men in the outpost didn't know the full plan. May had only told them to prepare fallback positions near the western trenches. No one asked questions. They had stopped doing that days ago. When the sun dipped below the clouds, the enemy chants began again. This time, closer, a deep rumble that carried through the wet air like drums. The sound of hundreds, maybe thousands, shouting as one. May froze for a moment, hand tightening around the metal handle of the transmitter. Kessler stepped beside her, his voice steady. "We start now, or we don't get another chance." She nodded. "Power up the beacon." He moved outside, wading through knee-deep mud toward the shoreline. The wind whipped the rain sideways, blurring the wreck's outline. Through the storm, May could just see him pulling the switch on the generator pack. The beacon gave a low hum. Then a flicker of blue light rippled along its corroded frame. Inside the bunker, The radio came alive. The static shifted, forming a rhythmic pulse, the sound echoing faintly through the open air. May adjusted the frequency, tightening the modulation until it reached the right tone, the kind that would mimic a distress call or guidance signal. She whispered to herself, "Come on, just hold." Then, through the static, came faint feedback. The signal was working. She looked up at the radar panel. The wave reflection was broadcasting strong and steady. Kessler returned, soaked to the bone, his face smeared with mud and salt. "It's running," he said, "but the current's building too fast. That battery's going to burn out in an hour, maybe less." "That's all we need," she said. "They'll come as soon as they hear it." He looked at her, serious but not angry. "You're certain?" "Yes." He hesitated, then said quietly, "If this fails, there's no one left to tell command what you tried to do." May gave a small, tired smile. "Then let's make sure it doesn't fail." Outside, the jungle's roar intensified. Through the mist, faint figures began to move along the ridge, lines of men advancing through the trees. The outpost scouts reported visual contact. 10,000 strong, moving fast, their battle cries rising in waves. Inside the bunker, May and Kessler worked side by side. Every movement was mechanical, precise, adjusting wires, rebalancing frequencies, timing the pulse intervals. The stress was constant but focused, leaving no room for panic. May could feel the fear pressing against her ribs, but it was the clean kind, the kind that sharpens the senses. Every click of switch, every hum of power felt magnified. She could hear Kessler's breathing steady beside her, the scrape of his boots against the floor, the faint tremor in his bandaged hand as he kept the system alive. Minutes dragged like hours. Then the sound changed. A faint rumble rolled through the ground, distant at first, then closer. Kessler looked at her. "They're charging." May adjusted the final dial, voice low but firm. "Then we're ready." For the next few minutes, there was nothing but the sound of rain, static, and the distant pounding of thousands of boots through the jungle. She keyed the transmitter one last time, sending a false flare signal. The pulse burst across the horizon. Kessler stood by the detonator switch, connected through the relay to the old minefield beneath the cliffs. He said, "Your call, Lieutenant." May took a breath, her voice calm. "Now." The detonator clicked. A second of silence. Then the cliffs erupted. The explosion was like a wall of thunder. Fire and smoke shot skyward, ripping through the ridgeline. The ground shook. The bunker's ceiling rained dust and dirt. The noise swallowed everything. Shouts, radio hum, even thought itself. May covered her ears, ducking under the table as the shockwave passed. Kessler stumbled, but stayed upright, watching through the narrow firing slit as the horizon flashed again and again. The mines had triggered perfectly. The charge had been lured straight into the killing ground. When the sound began to fade, May rose, her breathing uneven. She stared out at the burning ridge, her expression blank. Neither triumph nor horror, just disbelief that the plan had actually worked. Kessler turned to her, his voice almost drowned by the ringing in their ears. "You did it." She looked at him, then down at her shaking hands. "We did it," she said quietly. Outside, the rain began to fall again, washing black smoke into the sea. The false beacon flickered once more, then went dark, its metal shell collapsing under its own heat. May leaned against the bunker wall, exhaustion settling deep into her bones. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to breathe without counting the seconds between. The plan had worked. The island still stood. But as the smell of cordite and burning earth filled the air, she knew what they had done would never be written in any report, never be acknowledged by command. And yet, looking at Kessler, battered, steady, still watching the horizon, she understood something simple and final. They had survived not because of orders, but because they had chosen to. And in that choice, they had already won more than any medal could ever mean. The world outside the bunker had become a storm of sound, the kind that swallowed all sense of direction. The explosions had stopped, but the echoes still rolled over the cliffs like the sea itself was breathing in pain. May Callahan crouched beside the table, one hand gripping the radio key, the other pressed to her chest to calm her heartbeat. Her ears rang. Every sound came muffled, distant. When she finally looked up, the light bulb above her was swinging, throwing moving shadows across the walls. Kessler stood near the firing slit, one hand on the frame, his face streaked with soot and blood. The minefield had done what it was supposed to. The ridge ahead was unrecognizable, scorched trees, broken stone, and the twisted silhouettes of what had been a charging force minutes ago. He turned toward her. "It worked," he said quietly, almost unsure of it. May pushed herself up, her legs weak. "Is it over?" He shook his head. "For now." She moved to the entrance, stepping past broken glass and dirt. The air outside was thick with smoke, heavy enough to burn the throat. The rain was still falling, fine, warm, carrying the smell of metal and burned oil. From the cliffs below came the low hiss of steam as fire met seawater. Behind her, the radio crackled faintly. She went back, grabbed the headset, and adjusted the frequency again. Static. Nothing else. She tried the fleet channel, the backup, even the emergency line. All dead. Still nothing. Kessler asked. "No," she said. "We're still alone." He sat down beside the sandbags, resting his rifle across his knees. His left sleeve was soaked with blood where a piece of shrapnel had cut through, but he didn't mention it. May noticed and knelt beside him, tearing a strip from her undershirt to wrap the wound. He grunted as she tightened the knot. "You ever done this before?" "Only in training," she said. "But I guess this counts now." He gave a faint smirk, the first trace of humor she'd seen in him. "Yeah, I'd say it does." The moment was brief, but it steadied them both. Outside, the rain began to fall harder, masking the distant groans and collapsing debris. The silence after so much noise felt unnatural, like the air was waiting for something else to happen. May sat down beside Kessler, her hands still shaking. For the first time since arriving on the island, she let herself stop moving. Her thoughts went to the men who hadn't made it. The scouts, the technicians, the signalmen who'd held the other stations before they went silent. She wondered if any of them had seen the light from the explosions, if any had understood what she'd done. There would be no medals for this, no reports written. What she had ordered would never pass through official channels. It was effective, yes, but it was also forbidden, the kind of action that would be erased once command found out. Kessler must have read it on her face. "You think they'll call it wrong?" "They'll call it what they have to," she said. "Doesn't matter anymore." He studied her a moment longer, then nodded. "You did what they wouldn't. That's not wrong." For a long time, neither spoke. The radio's static filled the silence like a low hum, almost comforting now. The bunker's walls were scarred, the floor soaked, the air thick with heat and dust. Every few minutes, the ground shuddered slightly from distant aftershocks. May pulled a ration tin from a crate and handed it to him. "Eat something before you pass out." He accepted it, though his hands trembled slightly. They ate without speaking, the sound of rain against the metal roof steady and rhythmic. Hours passed before the noise outside faded completely. The night had grown quiet again, unnervingly so. Kessler finally stood, walked to the narrow lookout slit, and stared out toward the sea. In the distance, faint fires still burned along the shore, lighting the waves with orange reflection. "They won't try again tonight," he said. May joined him, standing close enough to feel the warmth of his shoulder. "No," she said. "They lost too much. They'll tell command about this," he said, "if anyone's left to tell it." She didn't answer. Instead, she turned back toward the table, switching the radio to its last functioning backup channel, a distress frequency reserved for emergencies. She pressed the key and spoke in a clear, steady voice. "Naval Outpost 37 reporting. Enemy assault neutralized. Position holding. Requesting medical evacuation for wounded personnel. Repeat, enemy advance neutralized. Outpost holding." She released the key. The silence that followed was absolute. Kessler sat back down, exhaling through his teeth. "If they hear that, we'll know by sunrise." May nodded. "If they don't, then it's just us." Her words hung in the air like smoke. She looked at him again, at the dirt on his uniform, the lines on his face, the quiet steadiness in his eyes. She wondered how many times he had been through nights like this, waiting for orders that never came, try to survive what no one else would know about. He noticed her staring and said softly, "You did good, Lieutenant." She lowered her eyes, embarrassed by the warmth in his tone. "We just got lucky. Luck doesn't dig up minefields and build transmitters out of scrap," he said. "Luck just keeps you breathing long enough to find people who can." She didn't answer, but her throat tightened. For the first time, she felt something close to calm. Outside, dawn began to push through the clouds. Not sunlight yet, just a paler shade of gray. The wind carried the faint scent of the ocean. From somewhere beyond the ridge, a single bird called, the first sound of life since the night began. May walked to the entrance and looked out. The cliffs were still smoking, but the sea beyond was calm again. It looked unreal, peaceful, almost indifferent to what had just happened. She turned back to Kessler, who was already checking the radio cables. "You really think they'll come?" she asked. He shrugged. "If they're still out there, they will. If not," he met her eyes. "We'll figure it out." May gave a slow nod. That was enough. As the first weak light touched the waves, she sat beside him again, both of them watching the static glow on the radio panel. There was no certainty left, no orders to follow, just the quiet, heavy truth that they had made it through the night. The rain eased. The sea turned silver, and somewhere far away, a faint, rhythmic pulse echoed through the radio, the sound of another signal finding its way through the static. May straightened, her heart racing. "That's them," she whispered. Kessler listened carefully, then smiled faintly. "Yeah," he said, "that's the fleet." Neither of them spoke again. They just sat in silence, side by side, as the morning light grew brighter and the sound of distant engines rolled in across the water. For the first time in weeks, the island felt less like a prison and more like a place they might finally leave behind. The signal from the fleet grew stronger with every passing minute, breaking through the static in short, clean bursts. May Callahan sat frozen, her hand hovering over the transmitter switch as if afraid that moving might make it disappear. She pressed the key again, her voice steady but trembling slightly. "Naval Outpost 37 responding. We read your signal. Coordinates confirmed. Repeat, we are alive." There was a brief silence. Then a voice came through, faint, distorted, but unmistakably real. "Copy that, 37. Hold position. Medical and recovery teams en route. ETA, 3 hours. You did good, Lieutenant." The words hit her like a slow exhale after weeks of suffocation. Her throat tightened, and she had to look away from the radio to steady herself. Kessler stood behind her, shoulders slumped from exhaustion, but there was a quiet satisfaction in his eyes. He hadn't smiled properly since arriving on the island, but now the faintest trace of one appeared. "They heard you," he said simply. May nodded. Finally, she leaned back, closing her eyes, letting the relief wash through her. The air inside the bunker still smelled of smoke and sweat, but for the first time, it didn't feel like a cage. It felt like a place that had done its job. Kessler sat beside her, pulling off his gloves and examining the cut on his arm. It had stopped bleeding, though the bandage was dark with dried blood. May noticed and stood to retrieve the first aid kit, but he stopped her with a raised hand. "It's fine," he said. "You've done enough. I'll decide that," she replied, kneeling down to change the bandage anyway. Her hands were gentle but firm, the movement automatic now, the kind of care that came not from training, but from a need to keep someone alive when there was no one else left to do it. He didn't resist. For a few seconds, neither spoke. The silence between them was no longer tense. It was full, grounded, the kind that didn't need filling. Outside, the storm clouds were breaking apart, letting thin stripes of sunlight touch the cliffs. The smoke from the destroyed ridge drifted out to sea, where it vanished against the brightening sky. From the far horizon came the distant rumble of engines, a sound both alien and familiar, the sound of rescue. May stood and walked to the entrance. The morning light caught her face, showing lines of exhaustion that hadn't been there weeks ago. She looked out over the beach where the old beacon lay half submerged, still smoking from the overload. It had done what it was never meant to do. It had saved them. Behind her, Kessler joined her at the doorway, watching the sea with the same cautious calm. "You think they'll believe what happened?" he asked. She shook her head. "No, not all of it. But they'll see the ridge, and they'll see we're still here. That'll be enough." "They'll call it unauthorized," he said. "Then they can," she replied. "We're alive, aren't we?" That answer made him nod quietly. He took a breath, wincing at the pull in his ribs. "You ever think about what you'll do when this is over?" May didn't answer right away. The question felt foreign. "I used to," she said finally, "before the war. Now I think I'll just try to go home." "Where's that?" She hesitated, eyes on the horizon. "Haven't decided yet." He gave a low laugh. "Maybe that's for the best." They stayed there for a while, listening to the sea. The noise of approaching engines grew louder, and soon dark shapes appeared against the light. Landing craft, moving fast. May raised a flare gun and fired into the sky. The bright red trail cut across the morning, hanging for a moment before fading. Within the hour, the beach was crowded with medics and sailors. The smell of disinfectant and diesel replaced that of burned gunpowder. Voices shouted orders, stretchers moved through the sand, and the wrecked outpost came back to life with motion. A few soldiers from another unit saluted May as they passed. She didn't know their names, but she saw the recognition in their eyes, respect without words. Kessler sat on a crate, being checked by a medic who insisted on wrapping his shoulder. He caught May's glance and gave a small nod. For all his quiet detachment, there was gratitude in his expression, not the kind you say out loud, but the kind that lives in the eyes of men who know they wouldn't be breathing without someone else's decision. As the rescue officer approached her, clipboard in hand, he asked, "Lieutenant, your report. Who authorized the counteraction last night?" May hesitated, her gaze drifting toward the wrecked beacon and the scorched ridge beyond. Then she looked back at him and said evenly, "No one. We acted under communication loss protocol. Defensive response only." The officer studied her face for a moment, then nodded, writing it down without comment. "Understood, ma'am." When the last wounded were loaded onto the landing craft, May stood at the water's edge. The ocean shimmered under a clear sky now, calm and blue, as if the night before had never happened. Kessler joined her, his arm in a sling, his steps slow but steady. "They're ready to pull out," he said. She looked up at him. "You coming back with the next unit?" He shook his head. "No, I think I've had enough war for a lifetime." She smiled faintly. "Then you're smarter than most." "And you?" he asked. "I'll go wherever they send me next," she said. "Until it's really over." Kessler gave a quiet sigh. "If anyone asks, I'll tell them you saved an island." She looked out over the waves. Just save what was left of it. When the boat engines roared to life, she and Kessler climbed aboard the last craft. The shoreline began to shrink behind them. The cliffs, the smoke, the broken bunker, all fading into distance. For the first time, May felt no fear in watching it disappear. She sat beside him as the wind rose, brushing her hair against her face. The soldiers around them were silent, exhausted, each lost in their own thoughts. But the sea ahead was wide and bright, stretching endlessly toward the horizon. Kessler glanced at her one last time. "You think the world will remember any of this?" May shook her head slowly. "Maybe not, but we will. And that's enough." He gave a small, content nod and leaned back, eyes half closed against the sunlight. The landing craft cut through the waves, carrying them toward the waiting fleet, towards something resembling peace. Behind them, the island grew smaller until it was nothing more than a shadow on the horizon. May looked once more toward it, her expression calm, almost peaceful now. For the first time since the war began, she allowed herself to believe they might have a future. The war was not yet over for the world, but for them, on that small, blood-soaked island, it had finally ended.